The signal didn't come through any telescope. It didn't arrive on a radio frequency, didn't pulse through any satellite dish pointed at the cold belly of space. It came through the water. Every ocean on Earth, the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Arctic, every body of water larger than a moderate lake began vibrating at exactly 3:14 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. Not violently. Not like an earthquake. It was subtle, the way a wine glass hums when a wet finger runs around its rim. A frequency so low that sleeping people felt it in their chests before their ears registered anything at all. Children woke up crying and couldn't explain why. Dogs refused to go near the shore. And then, 7 minutes after the vibration began, every screen on Earth, every phone, every television, every laptop, every billboard in Times Square, and every cracked tablet in a refugee camp lit up with the same image. It was not a face. It was a shape. A symbol. Something between a sigil and a mathematical proof, rendered in a color that human eyes had no name for, not quite ultraviolet, not quite the deep end of violet, but something that lived in the gap between those two things and made the optic nerve feel like it was being politely warned. Below the symbol, in every language simultaneously, was a single sentence. You have been assessed. Compliance is the only remaining option. That was it. No sender. No coordinates. No terms, no demands, no explanation of what compliance meant or who was doing the assessing. Just that sentence, sitting on every screen on Earth like a stone dropped into still water. Dr. Lena Marsh was in her office at the Global Communications Research Center in Colorado when it happened. She was 41 years old, had not slept properly in 6 days, and was halfway through a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. She was not the most famous linguist on Earth. She was not the most decorated. But she was the one who, in the 7 seconds after the message appeared on her monitor, did not scream, did not reach for her phone, did not call her mother or her ex-husband or her department head. She picked up a pencil and started copying the symbol by hand. Not because she thought she could decode it immediately, but because her hands needed something to do while her brain absorbed the fact that the world had just changed in a way that could not be unchanged. Her colleague Marcus Webb came through the door at a half-run, his tie loose, his face the color of old chalk. "Lena, did you see?" "I saw it. Every screen. Every language. Lena, it's in Swahili. It's in Welsh. It's in languages that have fewer than 1,000 living speakers." "I know. That means they've been listening. For a long time." He sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. "How long do you think they've?" "Long enough," she said. "Long enough that this message is not an introduction. It's a conclusion." She held up her hand-copied symbol. "They already know us. This is the part where they tell us what they've decided." Marcus stared at the paper in her hand. "And what have they decided?" Lena looked back at her screen, where the sentence still glowed in perfect English. "Compliance is the only remaining option. They've decided," she said quietly, "that the conversation is already over." Within 4 hours, every government on Earth had convened an emergency session. Within 6 hours, 3 of those governments had attempted to send response signals using their most powerful transmission arrays. Within 8 hours, all 3 arrays had gone offline simultaneously, not destroyed, not damaged, simply off, the way a light goes off when someone flips a switch from another room. The message remained on every screen. It did not update. It did not repeat. It simply stayed, patient and absolute, like a landlord's notice slipped under a door. The United Nations Security Council met in a room that felt, for the first time in its history, genuinely small. Ambassadors who had spent careers practicing the art of unreadable expressions sat around the oval table with the unreadable expressions completely gone, replaced by something rawer and more honest, the specific kind of fear that arrives when a person realizes that the rules they memorized are no longer the rules being played by. Secretary General Amara Diallo called the session to order with a steadiness in her voice that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever know. "We have 72 hours, she said. "To do what?" asked the Russian representative. "To decide who we are," she said. "Because whoever sent that message already thinks they know. And I would like us to have a different answer ready." No one spoke for a moment. Then the American representative, a former general named Howard Blaine, who had spent 30 years preparing for every conceivable kind of conflict, leaned forward and said the thing that everyone in the room was already thinking, but had not yet said aloud. What if compliance isn't the worst option? Lena, who had been brought in as a civilian advisor and was sitting against the wall with a yellow legal pad on her knee, looked up from her notes. It is, she said, if we don't know what it means. They called themselves the Vorath, not because they introduced themselves that way. They never introduced themselves at all. The name came from the symbol, the one that had appeared on every screen, which, after 72 hours of analysis by every linguistics team, cryptography unit, and mathematical research group on Earth, turned out not to be a symbol at all. It was a name. Specifically, it was a name written in a language that was not linear. Human languages move in a line left to right, right to left, top to bottom. Even the most complex human writing systems are, at their core, a sequence. One thing after another. The Vorath did not write in sequences. They wrote in densities. Every part of their symbol existed simultaneously and modified every other part, the way a chord is not a sequence of notes, but all the notes at once, each one changing the character of the others. Lena spent the full 72 hours in her office. She did not sleep. She drank 11 cups of coffee and ate whatever Marcus brought her without looking at it. She covered the walls with printed copies of the symbol at different scales and stood in the middle of the room turning slowly, looking at it from different angles, the way you would look at a sculpture. On the 68th hour, she understood something. It was not a full translation. She was not even close to that. But she understood one thing, and it hit her with the particular force of an idea that is both simple and enormous at the same time. The symbol was not just a name. It was also a description. The Vorath had written their name in a way that simultaneously described what they were. In their language, identity and nature were not separate concepts. You did not have a name that was distinct from your character. Your name was your character, compressed into a form that someone else could read. And what she could partially read, in that dense, simultaneous, chord-like script, was something like, those who finished. Not those who won. Not those who conquered or those who dominated. Those who finished. The word carried a sense of completion, of process concluded, of something that had run its full course. She wrote it on her legal pad and stared at it for a long time. Those who finished. Finished what? Finished whom? She did not want to know the answer. She also knew that not wanting to know was not an option available to her anymore. The Vorath ship, if ship was the right word for it, which it almost certainly was not, appeared in Earth orbit on the morning of the 73rd hour, roughly 17 minutes after the UN's self-imposed deadline had passed without any official response being sent. It was not what anyone had imagined. People had imagined a lot of things. Science fiction had spent 100 years imagining first contact vessels, the vast and ominous, the sleek and silver, the impossibly geometric. Humanity had a deep and extensive catalog of ways to picture something arriving from space. The Vorath object looked like weather. It was approximately 40 kilometers in its longest dimension, but it had no consistent shape. It shifted. Not rapidly, not dramatically, but continuously, the way clouds change, the way a slow river changes the shape of its own banks. It was dark, but not the dark of metal or stone. It was the dark of something that absorbed light and did something else with it, something that produced no reflection and no heat signature, and no electromagnetic output of any kind that human instruments could categorize. It simply hung above the Earth at a distance of approximately 300 kilometers, moving in orbit with a precision that suggested it was maintaining that position deliberately, and changed its shape slowly and continuously, like a living thing breathing. General Blaine, watching it on a monitor from a bunker in Nevada, said, "That is not a weapon." His chief science advisor said, "How do you know?" "Because a weapon holds still," he said. "That thing is thinking." The second message came 4 hours after the ship appeared. This time it was not on every screen. It was delivered exclusively to the United Nations building in New York, projected directly onto the exterior of the building's north wall in that same unnamed color, in every language simultaneously, as though the Vorath considered the UN to be Earth's speaking mouth and had decided to address it directly. The message was longer this time. You have been assessed across 412 of your years. Your pattern is understood. You build. You break. You build again. The cycle is familiar to us. We have recorded 61 civilizations that followed this pattern. 58 of them chose compliance when offered. 3 did not. Those 3 no longer generate accessible data. Compliance means continuation. Your terms are simple. Reduce your signal output by 80% within 30 days. Cease expansion beyond your current orbital boundary. Acknowledge Vorath oversight in all future developmental decisions. These terms are not negotiable. They are the terms under which you continue. Lena read it 4 times. Then she read it a 5th time more slowly, stopping at a specific phrase. 3 did not. Those 3 no longer generate accessible data. She wrote it on her legal pad. She underlined it. And then she wrote a single question underneath it because it was the question that mattered more than any other question anyone in any government bunker or military briefing room was currently asking. What did the 3 do? The question was not popular. When Lena brought it to the Emergency Advisory Council, a hastily assembled group of scientists, military strategists, diplomats, and one philosopher named Dr. Yusuf Antah, who had been included almost by accident because someone had misread his field as political science when it was actually philosophy of mind, the reaction was mostly impatience. It doesn't matter what they did, said General Blaine. They failed. That's the relevant data point. We don't know they failed, Lena said. We know they stopped generating accessible data. That's not necessarily the same thing. In what universe is it different? In a universe where the Vorath's assessment instruments have limits, she said. We're taking their word for what happened to the 3 civilizations. But the message was written to make compliance seem rational. That's not neutral information sharing. That's persuasion. There was a silence around the table. Dr. Antah, who had been quiet until this point and was taking notes in a small green notebook, looked up. She's right, he said. The message has a rhetorical structure. It's not just informational. It builds an argument. And in any argument, you should ask, what is the arguer leaving out? What are you suggesting? Asked the French ambassador. That we ignore the threat? I'm suggesting, Lena said, that before we decide whether to comply, we should understand what we're actually complying to. The terms aren't just restrictions. They're a relationship. Oversight means ongoing contact. Ongoing contact means ongoing influence. We'd be agreeing to let them shape every significant decision humanity makes going forward. That's not a ceasefire. That's absorption. Another silence. Longer this time. That may be the price, said Secretary General Diallo, of survival. It may be, Lena said. But I want to know what the other 3 civilizations thought that price was worth before we decide it's a price we can't pay. She found James Okafor through a chain of 6 forwarded emails that began with a colleague in Lagos and ended in a repurposed server room in Reykjavik, where a small team of people had been quietly working on something for the past 11 years that they had never published, never presented at a conference, and never, until now, shared with anyone outside their immediate group. James was 56 years old, Ghanaian-born, trained originally as an astrophysicist, and then as something that didn't have a clean academic title, part archaeologist of deep time, part systems theorist, part person who had spent over a decade looking for patterns in the deep background noise of the universe that other people had dismissed as static. He had found something, not the Vorath specifically. He didn't know about the Vorath until Lena told him, but he had found the absence of something, a specific kind of absence that, once you knew to look for it, was more alarming than any presence. Civilizations leave marks, he told her over a secure video connection, his face half-lit by monitors in a dark room. Not just radio signals. Anything that burns energy at scale changes the distribution of heat in a local region of space. The more complex the civilization, the more specific the thermal signature. I've been mapping these signatures for 11 years. He paused. And then I've been mapping the places where those signatures stop. Stop, Lena said. As in the civilization dies? As in the civilization changes, he said carefully. The signature doesn't disappear. It simplifies. Dramatically. A civilization that was generating complex, expansive, irregular energy outputs, which is what developing civilizations do, suddenly shifts to something very small, very regular, very contained. He pulled up a map on his screen and turned it toward the camera. This pattern, this exact contraction. I've found it in 11 locations across the galaxy. 11 civilizations that went from complex to contained. In every case, the contraction happened fast. Not over millennia. Over decades. Lena felt cold. And after the contraction? She asked. They persist, he said. For a long time. I can still detect them. They're still there. But they're small. They're quiet. He looked at her directly. They're managed. By the Vorath. I didn't know that name until 20 minutes ago. But yes. He paused. Lena, the 11 civilizations I found that contracted? They're the ones that complied. I haven't been able to find evidence of the 3 that didn't. He let that sit for a second. But I have found evidence of something else. Something that I initially thought was a measurement error. What? In one sector, about 600 light-years from here, there's an energy signature I can't categorize. It's not a civilization in any shape I recognize. It's not dead space. It's something that is generating enormous, complex, irregular output, and doing so in a pattern that looks almost random but isn't. He shook his head slowly. It looks like something that is actively trying to not be understood. Lena stared at his face on the screen. One of the 3, she said. Maybe, he said. Or maybe something that used to be one of the 3. Something that didn't stop. Something that found a way to keep moving without being seen. He leaned forward. Something that learned to be unaccessible. The Security Council voted 22-3 in favor of beginning compliance negotiations. Lena was not surprised. She would have been surprised by any other result. 22 governments looking at an object the size of a small city hovering above their planet and choosing defiance would have required a collective will that humanity, at this particular moment in its history, did not have stored up. Fear was not weakness. It was arithmetic. She voted no, in the role of civilian advisor, knowing her vote was symbolic. Marcus voted no beside her. Dr. Antav voted no without expression and then closed his green notebook and put it in his coat pocket in the particular way a person does when they have decided that a meeting is over regardless of whether it officially continues. In the hallway outside, Antav fell into step beside Lena, without being invited. You already have a plan, he said. It was not a question. I have a direction, she said. Plans require information I don't have yet. What direction? She stopped walking and faced him. The Vortha's language is simultaneous. Everything in it exists at once and modifies everything else. That's not just a communication style. It's a cognitive architecture. The way a species communicates reflects the way it thinks. She started walking again. They think in completed states, finished outcomes. Their word for themselves, their name, means those who finished. They don't experience process. They experience conclusion. Meaning when they assessed us over 400 years, they weren't watching us change. They were recording a pattern they expected to reach a predictable conclusion. To them, we're already a finished story. They just haven't filed the paperwork yet. She paused. But we're not finished. And the one thing a mind that thinks only in conclusions cannot process easily is genuine uncertainty, Antav said quietly. Is genuine novelty, she corrected. Not chaos. Not just the unexpected. Something that requires a category that doesn't exist yet. Something that forces them to build new assessment framework from scratch. She looked at him. They've processed 61 civilizations. They have a template for us. I want to show them something that doesn't fit the template. And what is that? I don't fully know yet, she admitted. But James Okafor does. Or he knows how to find it. She called the meeting in a basement conference room that was not on any official schedule. James flew in from Reykjavik. He brought 3 of his team, a thermal imaging specialist named Rosa Vega, a young mathematician named Daniel Chun, who had barely slept since the first message arrived and looked it, and an older woman named Harriet Solis, who had spent 20 years working in deep systems theory and said almost nothing but whose silence carried a specific weight that made people speak more carefully around her. Lena brought Marcus and Antav. No one else. She stood at the whiteboard and said, without preamble. We're not planning defiance. We're planning something more difficult than defiance. We're planning to become something they don't have a file on. Rosa looked up. What does that mean in practice? It means we don't fight them on their terms. We don't send warships they can calculate trajectories for, don't issue declarations they can translate and categorize, don't respond in any mode that fits their existing model of how civilizations respond to this situation. She wrote 3 words on the board. Novel, complex, incomplete. We have to be something that their assessment architecture cannot close a file on. Because a Vorath file that stays open is a Vorath that cannot act. You're describing deliberate cognitive obstruction of an alien intelligence, Daniel said, not unkindly. That's a sentence that has probably never been said before. Good, she said. That's the point. Harriet Solis spoke for the first time. The energy signature James found, she said. The unaccessible one. 600 light-years out. She looked at James. You said the output pattern looks almost random but isn't. Right. How long has it been generating? James checked his data. As far back as my measurements can reach. At least 200 years. Harriet nodded, very slowly. Then whatever that thing is, it's been successfully unaccessible for at least 200 years. She looked at Lena. That means there's a method. Not just luck. A method. She paused. I want to find it. So do I, Lena said. And I think I know who can help us. The name was not official. It was never designated, never formally titled, never entered into any government record or military registry. It emerged the way names for real things always emerge, from the people closest to the thing itself, who needed something to call it because calling it nothing was no longer an option. 3 people coined it simultaneously, in different rooms, on different continents, without knowing about each other, which was, in a way, appropriate, because the Black Armada was never one thing with one origin. It was a convergence. It began on one thread, with a woman named Commander Serena Voss. Serena was 44, the kind of tall that makes rooms feel slightly smaller, with a reputation in the space engineering community as someone who solved problems by refusing to accept the constraints those problems arrived with. She had spent 14 years working on deep space propulsion systems for a joint international program that had been, for most of those 14 years, massively underfunded and largely ignored by the governments that nominally supported it. The program was called Project Threshold. Its official mandate was developing propulsion and hull architecture for long-duration interstellar precursor missions, meaning ships that could survive extended travel beyond the solar system's heliopause. In practice, it was where brilliant engineers went when they wanted to work on something that actually mattered and had accepted that recognition was not part of the deal. When the Vorath message arrived, Serena was in a dry dock facility in orbit, one of 3 such facilities that Project Threshold operated at the L2 Lagrange point, watching her team run stress tests on the hull of a vessel she had been designing in iterations for 9 years. The vessel had no official name. Her team called it the Frame. The Frame was not beautiful, in any conventional sense. It was not the sleek arc of a science fiction spacecraft. It was a thing that looked like it had been assembled by someone who cared only about function and had the specific confidence to build something that looked strange because it worked better strange. Asymmetrical in cross-section. Hull plating in overlapping tiles rather than smooth sheets, each tile capable of independent micro-adjustment for thermal management. Drive systems distributed across the structure rather than concentrated in a traditional engine block so that the ship's thrust signature, when read from outside, was diffuse and irregular rather than the clean, analyzable bloom of a conventional engine. It was, Serena had always thought, a ship that would be difficult to understand from a distance. When she read the Vorath's message, specifically the part about accessible data and signal output, she felt something shift in her thinking with an almost physical sensation, the way a lens rotates into focus. She pulled up her communicator and called her lead engineer, a man named Tobias Grun, who was currently inside a maintenance crawlway somewhere in the Frame's port section. Tobias, she said. How long to make the drive signatures fully irregular? A pause, a muffled clang, then. On purpose. On purpose. Another pause. Why would you want? Then slower. Oh. Yeah, she said. Oh. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe 10 days if we skip sleeping. Skip sleeping, she said. On another thread, in a place that was not a facility anyone officially knew existed, a man named Admiral Wen Zhao was looking at a problem that had no name because naming it would have required admitting it was a problem. Wen was 61. He had spent his career in the branch of the Chinese space defense program that didn't appear in budget documents. His specific expertise was something that in professional circles was described, in bland and deliberately uninteresting language, as non-attributable propulsion research. What this meant, translated into honesty, was ships that couldn't be identified. Not invisible, not cloaked, simply built and operated in ways that made categorical identification. This is a military vessel from Nation X, structurally difficult. Ships that, when observed, generated data that resisted clean interpretation. Not by jamming or deception, but by being genuinely hard to categorize. He had 3 such vessels already built. They were small, crew of 8 each, and they were docked in an installation on the far side of the moon that had been kept off every public registry for 11 years. He had built them with a specific and narrow purpose: deterrence through ambiguity. If a hostile nation couldn't determine the origin of a response, retaliation became diplomatically complicated. But as he read the Vorath terms, specifically the part about reducing signal output by 80% and ceasing expansion beyond current orbital boundary, he understood that his vessels had a different purpose now. Not ambiguity as deterrence. Ambiguity as survival. He reached for his secure communicator. The first call he made was to a number that was not in his official contacts. It was a number he had memorized but never used, given to him 7 years ago at a conference in Geneva by a French aerospace engineer who had said, simply, if something truly unexpected ever happens, this is the person to call. He dialed. A woman answered on the second ring. Voss, she said. This is Wen Zhao, he said. I think we are working on the same problem. The third thread was the strangest one, and the one that most people, even inside the Black Armada, eventually found hardest to explain cleanly. It was a network. Not a formal organization, not a government program. A network of approximately 300 people scattered across Earth and its orbital installations loosely connected, who had been, for varying lengths of time and for varying reasons, working independently on different aspects of what they would each have described, in their own language, as the problem of being seen. Cryptographers who had extended their field from data security to emission security. Architects who designed structures that generated uncharacteristic thermal outputs. Artists, and this was the part that was hardest to explain, a specific cluster of artists, mostly working in generative systems and algorithmic composition, who had spent years creating works that resisted pattern recognition software, not as a political statement, but as an aesthetic challenge. What a machine cannot categorize, it cannot dismiss. That was the sentence that had circulated through this network for 3 years before the Vorath arrived, passed from person to person like a coin that kept turning up heads. When the message appeared on every screen and James Okafor's thermal maps began circulating through the network within hours, because this was a network built on sharing information that official channels wouldn't, the 300 people in it did not panic. Most of them thought something like, "This is exactly what we were preparing for," followed immediately by, "We were preparing for this, weren't we?" The answer was not quite yes. But it was closer to yes than anyone outside the network could have guessed. Harriet Solis had been right. It took 12 days, 3 false starts, and 1 full night where Daniel Chun sat at a whiteboard working through signal mathematics until the markers ran dry. But they found the method. It was elegant. That was the first thing Lena thought when she understood it. Not clever, not complex for the sake of complexity, elegant, the way a good mathematical proof is elegant. The kind of solution that, once you see it, makes you feel briefly ashamed that you didn't find it sooner. The civilization 600 light-years away, the one that had refused the Vorath terms, the one that had been generating unaccessible output for at least 200 years, was not hiding. They had not built some advanced cloaking system, had not gone dark and silent and hoped not to be noticed. They had done something more interesting and, in a way, more difficult. They had made themselves genuinely complex. Not in the sense of complicated, not an arms race of scale and capability. Complex in the technical, systems theory sense. They had deliberately structured their civilization's outputs, Energy generation, communication, spatial expansion, everything, so that the patterns they produced were of a kind that could not be predicted from any preceding data point. They behaved like a system in genuine, intrinsic novelty generation. The Vorath, James had said, thought in completed states. They assessed by pattern recognition, taking input data and mapping it to known categorical outcomes. A civilization that consistently generated outputs that didn't map to any existing category was not just difficult for the Vorath to assess. It was impossible, in a fundamental rather than a practical sense. The cognitive architecture required to categorize genuine novelty was not an architecture the Vorath possessed, because genuine novelty had never been a problem they encountered. In 61 civilizations, none of them had ever been genuinely novel. Because, Harriet said, in the quiet of the basement conference room, at 2 a.m, with empty coffee cups arranged in a small civilization of their own across the table, because most civilizations, when threatened, respond predictably. They fight or they yield. Both of those are patterns the Vorath have extensive data on.
She paused.
The 3 that didn't comply, 2 of them probably fought. And they were destroyed or they destroyed themselves, which is still a predictable outcome. But the 3rd one did something novel, Lena said. Did something genuinely, intrinsically, structurally novel. And kept doing it. For 200 years.
How?
Marcus asked. How do you make an entire civilization genuinely novel? That's not a technology. That's a mode of being. Yes, Harriet said. It is. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. I think they changed what they valued. At a civilizational level. They stopped optimizing for growth and stability, which are both predictable attractor states, and started optimizing for something that has no attractor state. For genuine creative transformation. For the continuous production of things that have never existed before. She looked at Lena. They made becoming their primary mode. Not arriving. Not completing. Becoming. Lena thought about the Vorath name. Those who finished. Opposites, she said quietly. Exact opposites, Harriet agreed. She brought it to Serena Voss and Wen Zhao in a conference call at 6 a.m, 3 days after the Black Armada network had formally consolidated under that name, or rather, 3 days after enough people had started using that name that it had become, practically, the real one. Serena listened without interrupting, which Lena had already learned was her default mode. Wen Zhao listened and took notes by hand in a small notebook. When Lena finished, there was a silence. Then Serena said, the frame. What about it? I've been working for 10 days on making its output irregular.
Diffuse.
Hard to categorize. A pause. But I've been thinking about it as a technical problem. A signature engineering problem. What you're describing is different. You're not talking about masking. You're talking about genuinely being something that can't be masked because there's no consistent signal to mask. She was quiet for a moment. That's a design philosophy, not a spec. Yes, Lena said. The whole Armada would have to operate that way. Every ship, every mission parameter, every decision about where to go and what to do when we get there would have to be made on the basis of what? Maximum categorical disruption. Maximum genuine novelty, Lena corrected. Not disruption for its own sake. That's just noise. The civilization we found isn't generating noise. It's generating something real and unpredictable simultaneously. The distinction matters. Another silence. How many ships? When asked. Every ship we can make that fits the design philosophy, Lena said. And I'm not just talking about hull architecture and drive signatures. I'm talking about everything. The people on those ships. The missions they run, the way they communicate, all of it operating outside accessible pattern. That's an enormous coordination problem, Wen said. Coordinating uncoordinated behavior. I know. It's almost a contradiction. Almost, she agreed. That's what makes it hard enough to be worth trying. The compliance negotiation team was real. Secretary General Diallo ran it herself, with a deliberate slowness that the Vorath, oddly, did not seem to object to. The Vorath, it turned out, were not impatient, or at least not impatient in any way that produced pressure. They simply waited, the way deep water waits, with no urgency because urgency is a property of things that can run out of time, and the Vorith, as best anyone could tell, did not experience time as something that ran out. This was useful. Lena had suggested, through channels careful enough that the suggestion looked like it came from a diplomat rather than from her, that the compliance terms be parsed extremely slowly, that every word of every sentence be treated as requiring independent verification and clarification. The Vorith had said the terms were non-negotiable, but they had not said they were non-discussable. And a discussion that moved at the pace of deep water was a discussion that bought 30 days. 30 days was not enough for most things. It was barely enough for this. The Black Armada, in its final form, was 19 vessels. Not a fleet in any traditional sense. Each ship was distinct in architecture, distinct in crew composition, distinct in mission parameters. Serena had designed 7 of them, including the frame, which was the largest, crew of 40, and each design was a deliberate departure from the others and from anything in the existing catalog of human spacecraft. One had contributed 3, already built and requiring only the modifications that made them, in Tobias Grunn's phrase, genuinely weird on every instrument. The remaining 9 came from the network, some half-built, some existing vessels significantly rebuilt from the hull inward, one that was a converted research platform that Harriet Solis had spent 8 days personally overseeing the reconception of, and that emerged from the process, looking like nothing so much as a question that had learned to fly. The crews were not military or not primarily. They were, and this required a specific kind of thinking to understand as a strategic choice rather than an administrative accident, people chosen for their capacity to operate productively in genuine uncertainty. Scientists, yes, but specifically scientists who worked at the edges of their fields, at the boundary lines where existing frameworks ran out. Artists, the algorithmic artists from the network, whose entire practice had been building things that resisted categorization. Engineers who had built careers on solving problems that the problems themselves hadn't known they were. 1 marine biologist. 2 historians of pre-contact civilizations, specifically civilizations that had maintained coherent identity through radical external pressure. A woman who had spent 15 years studying improvisation, musical, theatrical, social as a cognitive phenomenon, and who had a very specific theory about what genuine novelty, as opposed to merely unexpected behavior, actually required neurologically. Her name was Dr. Angela Rue. She was 37, and she had been in the basement conference room in the 3rd meeting when Harriet Solis talked about becoming as a mode, and had said quietly, in a way that had stayed with Lena since, "That's not a strategy. That's a practice. And like all practices, it requires daily work." Lena had recruited her immediately. On the 28th day, Lena stood in the frame's primary planning space, which was not called a bridge, because Serena didn't use bridge layouts, and looked at the crew assembled around a table that was not quite round and not quite rectangular, and had been built to a shape that emerged from a conversation between Serena and a furniture designer from Oslo, who thought in terms of how table geometry affected group cognition. She said, "I want to be clear about what we're doing, and what we're not doing." The room listened. "We are not going to war. We are not going to fight the Vorith, not because we couldn't, but because fighting is something they have extensive data on, and we would lose before we began." She paused. "We are not running away. We are not going to that unaccessible civilization 600 light-years away to hide behind them. Running away is also something they have data on." She looked around the table. "What we are doing is becoming something they cannot file. Something that requires a new category. Something that forces a pause in their process, and then extends that pause indefinitely." "How long?" someone asked. A young engineer named Pavel, who was on the frame as the propulsion lead for the unconventional drive array. "I don't know," Lena said. "Long enough that they have to reconsider. Long enough that when Earth is under Vorith observation, what they're observing is something that doesn't fit what they came prepared to process." She picked up the print of the Vorith symbol she still carried everywhere in a slightly worn folder. Their name means those who finished. Everything they do is built around conclusion, around the idea that process always resolves. We have to be the argument that it doesn't. "And the compliance team?" asked Harriet. "They'll negotiate for as long as the Vorith are willing to talk. The Vorith see that as the story, the yielding civilization that needs a little time to adjust." She folded the folder. We're the part of the story they haven't noticed yet. They left on the 29th day. Not in formation. Formation was a pattern. They departed at staggered intervals from different points in Earth's orbital sphere, some from the L2 installation, some from lunar orbit, some from low Earth orbit facilities that officially existed for research purposes and which were officially engaged in research purposes, as far as any record showed. The frame left last, at 4 a.m. Universal Time Coordinated, in a departure burn that was, by design, not a clean burn. Tobias had spent the past 3 weeks making the drive array produce thrust through a distribution pattern that would have made any propulsion engineer taught by traditional textbooks physically uncomfortable. It was not inefficient. It was, in fact, slightly more efficient than a conventional burn. But it looked on any instrument that tried to read its signature like something in the middle of figuring out what it was. Lena stood in the planning space and watched Earth diminish through the forward observation port. She had not slept properly in 8 days. This was not unusual. She had developed, at some point in the past month, a new relationship with exhaustion, not fighting it and not surrendering to it, but maintaining a kind of steady negotiation with it, the way you negotiate with weather. Serena came and stood beside her. "You're thinking about whether this works," Serena said. "I'm thinking about what works means," Lena said. "If we successfully become genuinely novel, if the Vorith genuinely can't categorize us, then what? They don't just leave. They have a ship in orbit, and they're still talking to the compliance team." "No," Serena said. "But they have to decide what to do about something they've never encountered. And every moment they're deciding, they're not concluding. And a Vorith that can't conclude is a Vorith that can't act."
She paused.
"We're not trying to defeat them. We're trying to make them think." "And you think making them think is enough?" Serena was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think making them think is the beginning of a conversation that isn't governed by their terms, which is more than anyone has managed in 61 previous civilizations." Lena looked at Earth, which was still visible, blue and white and small, and impossibly itself. "James says the unaccessible civilization has been generating for 200 years, she said. "That means they've been having that conversation for 200 years. Is that long? In Vorith terms?" Lena thought about it. "I think in Vorith terms, 200 years of unresolved assessment is probably something very close to what we'd call a crisis."
She paused.
"I want to give them 200 years, and one more crisis." On the second day out, something unexpected happened. The Vorith contacted them. Not through the general transmission. Not through any channel that the compliance team was monitoring. Directly on a frequency that no human instrument was transmitting on and no human communication system used. A frequency that was, in fact, slightly below the range of frequencies anyone had thought to monitor, because it occupied a narrow band between two categories of electromagnetic spectrum that human physics had always treated as distinct. The signal arrived in the frame's hull sensors. Not as a message, not in their symbolic, density language. As a question. Not words. A question as a form. A structural signal that had the architecture of inquiry, something that opened rather than stated, that created a space rather than filling one. Lena spent 6 hours with Daniel trying to understand it. What she eventually concluded was this. The Vorith had never, in 400 years of observing Earth, seen a ship like the frame. Not because the frame was unprecedented in capability, because it was unprecedented in form. In the way it moved, the way its drive signature distributed, the way its hull geometry changed subtly during the burn in response to the micro-adjustments that Tobias had designed in all of these things simultaneously, the frame was something that did not fit into any of the Vorith's 61 civilization datasets. And the Vorith had sent a question. Not a threat. Not a demand. A question. "They're curious," Daniel said, sitting back in his chair with the expression of someone who has just watched a certainty dissolve. "They're disrupted," Harriet said. She was leaning over the data readout with her hands flat on the table. "This is what disruption looks like for a mind that processes in conclusions. It's not distress. It's the cognitive state of a process that can't close." "They've never had that before," Lena said. "No," Harriet said. "And they don't know what to do with it." A pause. "Which means they're going to do something we haven't predicted." Because unpredictable response to genuine novelty is what unprepared minds do when they encounter it. She looked at Lena. We should be ready for anything. We've been ready for anything, Lena said. It's what we're built for. The Vorath question kept coming. Not in a loop, it was never the exact same signal twice. Each transmission was a variation, the way a musician varies a theme, which was itself interesting because the Vorath, as Lena had understood them, did not vary. They concluded. They categorized. Variation implied something was still open. Angela Rue was the one who understood it first. She came to the planning table on the third day out and said, without sitting down, "They're improvising." Everyone looked at her. In musical improvisation, genuine improvisation, not playing memorized variations, the improviser is in a state of continuous response to something they can't fully predict. The music leads and they follow, except they're also leading. It's a recursive loop of mutual influence. She sat down. The Vorath have never been in a recursive loop before. Every interaction they've had with other civilizations has been linear. They assess, they offer terms, the civilization responds predictably, they conclude. But the frame is not responding predictably. The frame's outputs keep generating data that modifies their existing model, which generates a new question, which generates a new signal, which, if we respond in a way that continues the pattern, generates more modification. She looked at Lena. They're not just curious. They're in a cognitive state they've never been in. They're following something they can't get ahead of. Which means they're temporarily incapable of concluding, Harriet said. More than that, Angela said. They're experiencing something. I don't know what to call it in Vorath terms. In human terms, the closest thing is, she paused, searching. The closest thing is wonder. The table was quiet. Wonder, Lena said. The cognitive state you're in when something exists that you cannot yet place, and you're not afraid of it, and you want to understand it, and the understanding keeps expanding the mystery rather than resolving it. Angela paused. I've been studying how that state functions in humans for 15 years. It's the state that produces the most creative output. It's the state that drives the most significant changes in understanding. She looked around the table. I've never thought about what it would be like to be a species that had never experienced it before, and then encountered it for the first time. At 61 civilizations old, Daniel said softly. Yes, Angela said. At 61 civilizations old. Having spent what might be millions of years processing only concluded things. She was quiet for a moment. That might be the most significant thing that has ever happened to them. They responded to the Vorath question on the fourth day. Not in words. Not in the Vorath's density language, which they did not fully understand, and not in human language, which the Vorath clearly understood but which would have been legible to them in a way that didn't serve the purpose. They responded in the only medium available that was inherently resistant to categorical interpretation. Music. Angela designed it. Daniel built the transmission system. It was not conventional music, not melodic in any familiar sense. It was a generative composition, an algorithmic structure that produced output that was always consistent with its own internal logic but never repeated, never arrived at a resolvable state, never moved toward a concluding form. It was music that was permanently in the middle of itself. They transmitted it on the same frequency the Vorath had used. For 3 hours there was silence. Then the Vorath ship in Earth orbit did something it had not done since its arrival. It changed shape. Rapidly. Not the slow, breathing shift it had been making continuously, a fast, radical change, as though something internal had shifted, as though the organism inside had moved. The compliance team in New York, watching on their monitors, thought it was preparing to act. General Blaine went to his highest alert level. The Secretary General stood at the window of her office with her hands very still at her sides. The shape settled. It was not the same shape it had been before. It was different, specific and deliberate and different. Lena, receiving the visual data on the frame, looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "It's trying to write something." "Write what?" Marcus asked. "I don't know." She pulled up the rendering on the planning table's display. The shape it's made, it's not a weapon configuration. It's not a departure configuration. She stared at it. It's a response. To the music? To the music, she said. It changed its shape to say something back. She spent the next 2 hours trying to read the shape the way she had learned to read the Vorith symbol, not as a sequence but as a density, everything at once. At the end of 2 hours, she had something. It was not a complete translation. She suspected a complete translation might not be possible because the Vorith might be working in concepts that had no human equivalent yet. But she had something. It was something close to. We have not done this before. Back on Earth, the compliance negotiation continued. Secretary General Diallo kept it going through a combination of genuine diplomatic skill and a specific kind of principled stalling that she would never have called stalling in any official document, but which was, functionally, stalling. She asked clarifying questions. She requested term definitions. She posed theoretical scenarios. She treated every Vorith communication as deserving careful, thorough, respectful analysis, which it did, and which also took time. The Vorith negotiating presence, a signal relay, not a physical representative, remained patient, unhurried. But Diallo noticed on the 33rd day that the relay's responses had begun to carry a quality they hadn't had before. She couldn't define it precisely. She was a diplomat, not a linguist. But she had spent 40 years reading the subtext of communications from parties with interests they were not directly expressing, and she felt, in the signal, in the timing, in the slight changes in linguistic density, something that she would, in her private notes, describe as hesitation. The Vorith were hesitating, not delaying, not stalling, as she was. Genuinely hesitating, the behavioral signal of a process that had reached a fork it had not planned for. She didn't know about the frame's music. She didn't know about the Vorith ship changing shape. She didn't have direct contact with the Black Armada, which was by design. The less she knew, the less she could inadvertently signal. But she could feel the hesitation, and she did what any diplomat does when they feel the ground shift under a negotiation. She slowed down further. On the frame, Lena and Angela were working on the question of what to do next. The Vorith had said, in its shape language, "We have not done this before." It was not a request for explanation. It was not a demand. It was, and Angela had been thinking about this for 2 days, turning it over carefully, it was an offering of status. The Vorith was describing its own state to them, sharing information about its inner condition. That was not what an authority did with a subject. That was what one party in an uncertain exchange did with another party it had begun to regard as a genuine unknown. "They're treating us as peers," Angela said. "Or as a puzzle," Harriet said. "Not mutually exclusive," Angela said. "In fact, being treated as a puzzle by a sufficiently interested mind is closer to being treated as a peer than anything else on the spectrum." She paused. "The question is, what do we do with it?" "We keep going," Lena said. "We don't interpret it as an opening for a conventional exchange. We don't send a diplomatic message. We don't ask for anything. We keep being what we are." Which is what? Something that doesn't conclude. She looked at the rendering of the Vorith ship's new shape on the display. "They said they haven't done this before."
Good.
"Neither have we. We're doing something none of us has a script for, alongside a species that thought it was done encountering things without scripts." She paused. "The script is the enemy of all of this. The moment we respond in a way that fits a recognizable pattern, we give them something to categorize. We have to stay ahead of the pattern." "That's exhausting," Marcus said, not as a complaint, but as an honest observation. "Yes," Lena said. "It is. That's also probably part of why only one civilization managed it long term. It's not a one-time act of defiance. It's a continuous practice." She thought of Angela's word from weeks ago.
Practice.
Every day, in every decision, in everything we transmit and do and build, we have to choose the response that expands the unknown rather than resolving it. That's not a strategy you can execute once, and then rest. She was quiet for a moment. It's a way of being that you have to choose over and over. "And if we stop?" Pavel asked. "Then we give them something to categorize. And a categorized thing can be concluded." They reached the first waypoint, an uninhabited system 40 light-years out that James had identified in his thermal mapping data as a location with unusual, irregular energy dynamics, possibly a naturally complex system whose physics might serve as cover for the Armada's activities. On the 41st day, The other 18 Armada ships were already there, at staggered positions chosen by their captains through a decision-making process that Lena had given them in the form of a principle rather than a protocol. Go where your genuine curiosity takes you, modified only by the question of what we haven't seen before. Each of the captains had interpreted this differently. The result was a configuration that looked, on any instrument trying to read it as a fleet, like nothing so much as a group of people who had arrived at the same party through different doors at different times and had not yet decided to coordinate. Which was, Lena supposed, more or less accurate. She called a captain's meeting on an encrypted relay, 19 faces, or, for the 3 who preferred audio only, 19 presences, assembled in the frame of the communication system. She said, the Vorth initiated contact with the frame 4 days out. Not through official channels. Through a frequency they opened specifically. They sent something that reads as a question. The silence had a specific quality. 19 people absorbing the same thing at the same time. They're curious, she said. That's the operative state. They've never encountered a genuinely novel thing before, and the frame is, at minimum, genuinely novel enough to produce curiosity. Which means our primary task going forward is not evasion. It's not hiding. It's being interesting enough that curiosity stays ahead of conclusion. A captain named Dr. Mina Osei, a systems biologist who commanded the vessel Harriet, had called a question that had learned to fly, said, interesting to an alien cognition we don't fully understand. How do we optimize for that? We don't optimize, Lena said. Optimization is pattern convergence. We need pattern expansion. What we do is what we've always done. We follow our genuine curiosity, we build what we've never built, we go where we haven't gone, and we report back not just what we find, but what we don't understand about what we find. The mystery is the message. She paused. The Vorth named themselves those who finished. We are the thing that doesn't finish. Every time they think they're close to a category that fits us, we generate a new dimension. She looked at the grid of faces. Is everyone clear on what that requires of them personally? Most of them nodded. Dr. Osei said, it requires being genuinely ourselves. Yes, Lena said, which is harder than it sounds. She knew they wouldn't have 200 years. Not this crew, not these ships, not these specific people. Human lives were not built for 200 years. But the civilization 600 light-years away had not managed 200 years through the longevity of individual people. It had managed it through the transmission of a practice. The way any culture transmits what it values most, not through documentation, but through the lived example of people who embody it and raise other people who embody it. The Armada was not a fleet. It was, Lena was increasingly certain, a culture in the earliest, most fragile stage of formation. She wrote this in her notes on the 43rd day, sitting in her cabin on the frame with the observation window showing the unnamed system around them. 3 planets, 2 gas giants, a central star that burned slightly cooler than Sol and cast everything in a light that was distinctly amber, like perpetual late afternoon. She wrote, we are not building a military. We are building a way of living that can be transmitted, that can be chosen, again and again, by people who have never met the original choosers. She thought about Earth, where the compliance negotiation continued, and people woke up every morning under a sky that contained a Vorth ship and tried to maintain some version of ordinary life. She thought about the Secretary General, who had been given nothing except a vague understanding that there were people buying time with something other than diplomacy, and who had trusted that enough to keep talking slowly, carefully, without panic. She thought about James Okafor in Reykjavik, whose thermal maps had started all of this, who had been looking at the universe's own handwriting for 11 years, and had learned to read the difference between absence and the kind of presence that hides itself not out of fear, but out of wisdom. She thought about the Vorth, and tried, as she had been trying since the beginning, to understand them without judgment. They were not evil. Evil was a category that required a certain kind of moral architecture, and the Vorth operated in a different moral architecture entirely, one in which the conclusion of a process was intrinsically good because completion was the only good they had ever conceived of. They had spent what might be an incomprehensible span of time shepherding civilizations to what they understood as a stable state. They were, in their own terms, caretakers. The problem was that their version of care was a version in which nothing new ever happened. On the 47th day, the Vorith ship moved. Not toward Earth. Not toward the Armada. It moved toward the signal that James had identified, the unaccessible civilization 600 light-years away. Not physically, it was still in orbit, but it directed a sustained transmission burst toward those coordinates for 11 hours. The compliance team intercepted and recorded it, but could not decode it. Lena received the data relay from Earth and spent a full day with Daniel trying to understand what it meant. What she eventually concluded was that the Vorith were not reporting to their home. They were not sending for backup or requesting guidance. The structure of the transmission, what she could read of it, had the form of inquiry, not report. Dense, simultaneous inquiry, directed outward, at something they apparently had an existing channel to. "They're talking to the third civilization," she said. Daniel looked at her. "The unaccessible one? They've had contact with it before. They must have. The channel already exists." She thought hard. Which means the Vorith's assessment of that civilization is not that it was destroyed. They said 3 did not comply, and those 3 no longer generate accessible data. But that was the public message. The persuasion document. She picked up her folder with the Vorith symbol. If they have an active communication channel, if the unaccessible civilization is a party they're currently consulting, then the situation is more complicated than comply or die, Daniel said. The situation, she said slowly, is that the Vorith have encountered exactly one civilization in their history that defied them and survived. And they've been in contact with it for at least 200 years. And now they've encountered something new. And they're asking that civilization. She stopped.
"They're asking them what we are," she said.
"They're asking the one civilization that chose what we're choosing to help them understand us." The quiet in the cabin was the kind of quiet that arrives when something shifts irrevocably. "Which means," Daniel said, "that out there somewhere, there's a civilization 200 years ahead of us on this path. And the Vorith just told them about us." The response came 12 days later. Not from the Vorith. From the coordinates of the unaccessible civilization, on a frequency the frame had never monitored, in a form that was neither Vorith density language, nor any human communication format. It was something else entirely. It took Angela, Daniel, Harriet, and Lena working together for 3 days to extract any meaning from it. The transmission was not a code. It was more like, and Daniel said this with the slightly dazed expression of a person trying to describe something at the edge of their conceptual vocabulary, it was more like a shape of attention. A structured way of looking at something that, if you looked from the right angle in the right cognitive posture, allowed you to see what it was looking at. What it was looking at was the Armada. Specifically, what it was looking at was the quality of the Armada that the Vorith couldn't categorize, the genuine novelty, the pattern that wasn't a pattern, the continuous becoming. And embedded in the shape of its attention, readable the way you read the direction of someone's gaze, was something that had no precise translation, but that Lena rendered, in the worn legal pad she'd been writing in since the first night of the Vorith signal, as, "Yes, like this. You're doing it right. Keep going." She held the legal pad for a long time. Outside the frame's observation window, the amber light of a star humanity had never named before fell on hull plates that were currently configured in a way they had never been configured before, on a ship that was in the middle of becoming something it had never been, in a system that was adding itself quietly to the map of everything humanity was learning to be curious about. She thought, 200 years. Then she thought, that's a beginning, not a limit. For months after departure, the compliance negotiation reached a natural pause. The Vorith, through their relay, communicated something that the Secretary General's translation team rendered as, "Reassessment is underway. Current terms are suspended pending conclusion of new assessment framework." It was not a withdrawal. The ship was still in orbit. The terms were still technically on the table. But suspended pending conclusion of new assessment framework was, in Lena's understanding of Vorith cognitive architecture, something roughly equivalent to, "We don't have a working category for what you are right now, and we cannot conclude without a category, and so we cannot act." The compliance team celebrated quietly, in the specific way people celebrate when a catastrophe has been delayed rather than avoided, with relief that is real and joy that is careful and the specific kind of tiredness that comes after very long fear. General Blaine sat in his bunker in Nevada, and looked at his empty desk for a long time. He had spent 30 years preparing for war and had somehow ended up in a situation that had been navigated by a linguist, a thermal imaging specialist, and a composer of music that didn't resolve.
He was not sure how he felt about that.
He was, after a while, sure that he felt grateful. The Black Armada did not return. Not because they were lost. Not because they were destroyed or captured or absorbed. They were out there still transmitting at irregular intervals on frequencies that shifted according to a logic that was consistent but not predictable, producing data that the Vorith received and could not close files on, generating a continuous, living argument in the form of existence against the premise that all processes conclude.
New people joined them.
This was not simple. The journey out was long. The resources required were significant. The selection process was deliberately imprecise and therefore difficult to institutionalize. But young engineers and artists and scientists and philosophers who grew up under the amber light of the reassessment, who had been children when the Vorith signal arrived on every screen, who had never known a world that wasn't aware of being watched, some of them chose the Armada. Not as an escape, as a vocation. The practice was transmitting. Lena stayed on the frame for 2 years. Then she came back. Not because she had finished. She had specifically built an existence around never finishing, and she had been practicing it long enough that it had become, if not comfortable, then genuinely hers. But because she understood, toward the end of the second year, that the part of this work she was best suited for was no longer the part that required being in deep space. The practice needed people who could teach it. And teaching it required being in the places where the next generation of practitioners was being raised. She landed at the Colorado facility where she had spent the first night of the Vorith contact, copying a symbol by hand because her hands needed something to do while her brain absorbed the change of the world. The facility was different. Everything was different in the way things are different when they have been living rather than merely existing. There were young people in the hallways who did not have the specific weight of the before time in their posture, who moved through a reality that had always included the amber question mark of the Vorith ship above them and had therefore constructed their sense of possibility around a different premise than any previous generation. Marcus met her at the door. "How was it?" he said. She thought about the unnamed system, and the amber light, and the music that never resolved, and the message from a civilization 200 years ahead of them on a path no map had named yet. "Incomplete," she said. He smiled.
"Good."
"Very," she said. And then she went inside and found a whiteboard and picked up a marker and started working on what she had learned, which was only the beginning of what there was to learn, which was only the newest edge of what it meant to be something that did not finish. The Vorith ship was still in orbit. Its reassessment was still underway. It would be underway for a very long time. The Black Armada has no home port. It has no flag. Its only mission is the one that cannot be completed. In every civilization that the Vorith have categorized, the ones that remained were the ones that accepted conclusion. The Black Armada's answer to that record was not defiance. It was a practice. A daily, continuous, irreversible choosing of the open over the closed, the question over the answer, the becoming over the arrived. Whether that practice would hold across generations, whether the children's children of those first 19 crews would still choose it, still feel it as theirs rather than inherited, nobody knew. That was the point. Nobody was supposed to know yet. That was what made it worth continuing. And